Good evening, members and officers of the Council and members of the public. Welcome to this meeting of Governance and Audit Committee. Just a little bit of housekeeping. The fire alarm procedures: if the fire alarm is activated, please vacate the offices via the stairs. Please do not use the lifts. Assemble in Hawley Square on the green. Officers will assist you and advise you when it is deemed safe to return to the chamber. Filming. Does anyone intend to film the meeting? No? Perfect. Restrictions of mobile phones. Would everyone present please ensure their mobile phones are turned to silent and that they are not used to make or receive phone calls in the chamber while the meeting is in progress. Please note this meeting is being live streamed for members of the public. The meeting will be recorded and will subsequently broadcast on the Council's YouTube channel. Are there any members who wish to speak under Council Procedure Rule 20.1? There's no members. I'll just move on to agenda item 1, apologies for absence. There have been apologies received from Councillor Braidwood and Councillor Pat Moore, who's been substituted by Councillor Yates. Moving to agenda item, are there any other apologies for absence? Okay. Declarations of interest, are there any declarations of interest? Nope. Agenda item 3, minutes of the meeting held on the 28th of September 2022. To approve the minutes of the meeting held on 28th September 2022, copy attached to the agenda pack. Please can I have a proposer and a seconder. Councillor Duckworth.
There was just a bit missing from the minutes, page 7, item number 6, as part of the discussion on the complaints procedures. I did suggest a flowchart to help residents make complaints. This wasn't necessarily about individuals, but more so that we've got an opportunity for residents to help us shed a light on where things can fall through the net in our systems. But basically, that was a suggestion I made in discussion raising the following points. If that could be added in, please.
Yeah. If members are happy with that, can we have a proposer and a seconder? Proposed by Councillor Shrub, seconded by Councillor Duckworth. Unless I hear any objection, I will take these as approved. Moving on to agenda item 4, an update on corporate property issues. Mark Peace, would you please provide your update?
I'm the interim property director. I joined in July, so my work is only 5 months in. But I was asked to look at how we would, in our resourcing, the ways in which we can secure the maximum amount of revenue that we might well have been losing previously. And I've also looked at some statutory compliance issues as well that we're addressing. So a brief bit of background for those not aware. We've got a mixed-use portfolio. I deal with the non-housing assets, so the commercial assets. There's 727 of them in all. Some of them are just land, but there are 338 active sites within the portfolio. For the purpose of this exercise, I've taken the general fund, I've taken Port and Harbour, and the HRA properties. They are just the telecoms and masts that are above those properties. So the nuts and bolts of it is we've got a current rental income of about £2.2 million per annum, yet the estimated rental value of our portfolio is about 3.14. So we're about £1 million short in what we could be collecting. And one of the issues that we've got is that there are 200 outstanding lease renewals and rent reviews. And many of those outstanding rent reviews are predated from 2016, so some of them are 6 years out of date. So the good news is that's a lot of opportunity to get revenue in. And if you look at the three different funds that we work with, Port and Harbour and HRA are on normally are on standard indexed rent reviews, therefore there's not too much discrepancy there. But in the general fund, there's they are reviews to market value, and as I outlined before, we have about 200 properties where people are in occupation, but they haven't, or their leases have expired, and they require lease renewals before we can enact those rent reviews. I've put in here a little bit of information about capital receipts, which comes from disposals, which is relevant later on when we talk about funding the repairs and maintenance in the portfolio. In addition to rent, I think we have issues in the portfolio that we need to address. There's a significant backlog of repairs and maintenance and statutory compliance, which needs to do. And part of the problem with that, most normal portfolios would have a planned maintenance schedule, which you would just update on a yearly basis. Due to the staffing shortages that we've had and the high turnover of staff in the department, we don't have that schedule to hand. So we've had to go out over the 350 active properties and commission cost surveys and condition surveys. I've outlined the ones that we've already commenced in A, and we've also got approval to do another 20 major condition surveys. And I've given some example. So, and it is a risk, so we don't know fully until we get those reports back, which will be costed, the true cost of those works. So I've been estimating, and what we have had back from the surveys that we've had back and the surveys that have been around the properties is that last year we were had 115,000. This is in the general fund, not the Harbour Arm or the HRA, but in the general fund, 115,000 was allocated for repairs and maintenance. I estimate next year that figure will be about £1 million higher, 1.138. There's good and bad news in that. There's obviously bad news in that we're having to expend that money, but good news in that we're putting those properties into what hopefully is a safe or at least a wind and watertight condition. Statutory compliance is obviously a big issue for all of us, and we recruited in September an asset compliant officer. He's already identified 125 properties which require energy performance certificates, and we've added another 2 EPC firms to the supplier list, and now we have engaged 3 firms to carry out the priority 1 EPCs, and that completion of that work is anticipated at the end of January. From then, we will then have a better idea, although I have estimated in that repairs and maintenance schedule an estimate of that work on an average based on other properties who fall below level E on the EPC register. So with the asset compliance officer coming, we've done a number of site inspections, and he's got an ongoing case to try and cover the majority of the portfolio. And already he's highlighted 8 additional risks which have been added to the estates register. Jackie Baker's Pavilion, Tivoli, and a few others are examples of those. We're beginning to get to grips with the estates stat compliant register. It wasn't in a great condition, I have to say, when we joined, but we're now working with Bob's team. They've got the True Compliance software package, which works very well on the housing, and we're trying to transfer that over, although without running the risk of corrupting Bob's data, so trying to set it up separately for ourselves. So how are we going to do it? Well, obviously the condition surveys and the EPC surveys and a financial allowance for those works is one way. That's physical resourcing, but the most important thing, I think, is the human resourcing. So in the relevant departments that are focusing on income and direct asset management, as at 1st of June, which was a month before I joined, you had 2 estate surveyors, 1 interim, an acquisition disposal surveyor, and a rent officer. So you just had 4 people carrying out that function, which is monumentally understaffed. We've done quite well. Obviously, we've recruited myself. We've recruited 2 additional estate surveyors, both interim, and the asset compliance officer I referred to earlier. Up to the end of this financial year, we have approval, which needs to be finally signed off in Cabinet on the 15th. But it's cost neutral because of the rent reviews that they'll be doing. We're out in the market currently for 2 more estate surveyors on an interim basis, and they will be income focused. Then, from the next financial year up to March 24, obviously we're hoping to retain all the above, but add on 3 estate surveyors, and they will be split between asset management, which is the more strategic side of it, and including disposals, a compliance-orientated person to support the person that we've already got, and an audit data management specialist. And we will have 4 project decarbonisation, repairs and capital staff. That, again, to be confirmed at the Budget Council, I believe in February. That's it. If anybody's got any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Thank you, Mark. Members, any questions? Councillor Garner.
Thank you. Thank you for that quite enlightening presentation. It's quite a lot to take in, actually, without having seen it before we came along to the meeting. But a couple of things. I mean, I'd like us to have the opportunity, actually, if you don't mind, to come back to this after we've had a time to digest all of this, because I think there's quite a lot in there of concern. But a couple of would you be able to go back to one of the first slides? Yes. I think the second or third. Right near there. There you go. That one. Yep. So, just for clarification for me, so what you're saying here is that we've been missing out on £750,000 a year of the potential rental of the properties that we own as far as the general fund is concerned.
Correct.
And how many years is that for?
It is a great reading. If you go back to the tenancy schedule and look at it in data, and you look at the average time that some of the last rent... Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry. The average time, I think that some of the last rent reviews were done as an average, was around about 2018. So some were some about 4 years out. Not on all of them, but about on average about 4 years. That's on some of the, particularly on beach concessions and smaller items, because we just haven't had the staff to do it. And there are some that predate 2016.
Okay. Thanks. I did have a couple of more questions,
Chair,
but I'll
is it
see.
right if I make an extra comment to that, just to that question? Yeah, I would say I just think we need to be a little bit cautious about seeing that figure and thinking, oh, that's all income that is potentially available and could, help solve some of the council's financial pressures. It absolutely isn't. Mark's right, that's potential additional rent stream income from the property portfolio. However, the reason that that portfolio is underperforming is that the team haven't had the staff to renew leases and to review rents and to get those into payment. And the proposals that we've put through the staff chamber process and will be incorporated into the budget, the vast majority of that gap effectively is needed to fund the resources that are required in the team. So we'll get to a point where, yeah, the portfolio is performing, but our costs of managing the portfolio have gone up. In the longer term, we think there's potentially further gains that could create some financial benefits, but in the short to medium term, what we're really talking about is creating the headroom to be able to increase the size of the team to the level that's needed to do the job that is required in managing over 700 assets.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I understand that now better. Thank you. Thanks for that explanation. But I guess my comment would be, though, that it's all been reviewed now. If this had been done, I don't know, I'll use the word correctly, over a period of time, we wouldn't be in the position we are now. So if this had been correctly managed from 2016 and before, and we'd been building up the team that we required to manage these properties, we wouldn't be in the position we are now, and we would have been able to benefit from being able to maximise the potential of the property. And I'm not saying that we would be £1 million better off, because a lot of that would be costs for staffing and such like. But if we'd better managed this over a period of time, then we wouldn't have to be in the position of now looking to spend a lot of money that we don't, as you say, we don't have, so as we can get into a position we should have been in at the beginning of that period, is sort of the way I'm reading it anyway. But one of the other things I heard you say was about lease renewals. So the number of leases haven't been renewed, but I didn't quite understand. Does that mean that where a lease has come to the end and they haven't been reviewed, those occupants who were leasing that property have left? Or are there actually some occupants still in property but aren't paying their lease because we haven't had the staff to renew their leases and review their leases? And
Yeah, that's a very, very, very good question. It's a mixture of both. Sorry, I thought we had. Oh, that's a good question. And that's half true, half not true. So when your lease expires and you haven't got a new lease, you're what's known as holding over. Some councils, like Kent, don't charge any rent at all for fear of making a statutory tenancy. Thanet does, but when we're coming to certain situations, like a rent review, I can think of a historic one where one surveyor's got involved in recently, and they're paying a rent that's 8 years out of date, which is a quarter of what the current market value is, because the lease hasn't been renewed under the terms, and the rent reviews haven't been carried out. So it's a difficult question, and there's also another question which I think you might be thinking of. Well, are we looking to backdate that rent? It's a very good question. I don't think in the economic market you can, because if I'm honest, that's due to the mismanagement by ourselves, and it's not the current tenant's faults. And if you go and backdate it too far, there's legislation which prevents you from doing that. The lease prevents you to, because some of the rent reviews have to be done on specific times. But what we are tending to do is, if it's 12 months, go back 12 months, like effectively to a beginning of a year that we're doing it. And in that case, the tenants have been more willing to pay a full rent, which helps us going forwards, rather than if you backdate it. RICS regulations would tend to resist you doing a full market rent backdated 4 or 5 years. It's just not fair on the tenant. unless you've been in legislation against them and they've been in court resisting the rent. So the furthest at the moment I'm instructing my surveyors to go back is 12 months.
Okay, thank you. So you are saying then we do currently have tenants who aren't paying any rent because their leases haven't been reviewed and they haven't got the rents updated. And where the leases were ended, they were paying rents that, because they hadn't been reviewed, were lower than they could have been, and that all sort of adds up to the gap that was shown on the previous slide. Okay, so all right. I mean, it's quite an issue. In the main, we are collecting rent. Where you have trouble is if the lease hasn't been renewed. It's very difficult to charge a service charge. So for the electric and other heating and all those sorts of things, if there isn't a valid current lease in place. So it impacts in other areas. The other issue, just to say about the positive side looking forwards, if you don't put oil in your car, and the analogy being with repairing a property, then you get a bigger breakdown cost than if you were doing the repair. So some of our buildings have got accumulated repair and maintenance items that would be much less if we'd have attacked them earlier in the process. So it's going to be a painful year, at least, to try and catch up on the repairs and maintenance. But when we've done that, and the additional staffing in place to do that, and we have planned preventative maintenance schedules, hopefully on all of our buildings, then the net outgoings to us will be much less. The value of the properties will increase, and therefore the rental values will go up of those properties. So that I hope in about 18 months' time, the net value of the property portfolio should go up considerably. Okay, thank you. I mean, I do see I can see the positive in this. I mean, we can't fix a problem until we've fully identified and got it out on the table, so to speak. So now it is out and we do we're getting to understand the scale of the issue, then we can tackle it and resolve it. But it's obviously going to, like you say, it's going to be quite a lot of pain budget-wise, especially in the current market where you're mentioning about not being able to charge for services like electricity and gas, where the bills to us are going to be going up and up and up, aren't they? So it's going to be costing us even more to service these properties that we're not able to collect the service charge off of people for. So thank you.
Just a quick comment, sorry Chair, on the budget and the figures in the report, in the slides. We have based the figures on the information that we've fed into the budget build for next year. Obviously that still needs to be approved, but there are proposals coming forward for how we will meet some of those costs. Clearly, I mean, as Mark said during the presentation, there are costs out there that we don't currently know about, but the ones that we do know about, where we have been able to, we've put them into those figures. So where we don't know about them, obviously we'll need to have a longer term plan for those.
Just want to, Mark and Bob may have already sort of articulated, but the plan that we've got in place, it's almost a bit of a virtuous circle. By having the appropriate staff in place, we can generate the revenues, but fund the staff, would then allow us to invest back into our properties. So that's the long-term plan. So hopefully it will feed itself, rather than this situation we found ourselves in, which has been a vicious cycle, or a bit of a death spiral, or doom cycle, as accountants like to refer to, where we've not had appropriate staff, so we've not been able to collect the rents, and we've not been able to invest in the assets. So we're flipping that round now, and we should be able to address the issues that Mark and Bob have referred to.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, sorry, just one other thing. I guess one thing we do need to do is learn lessons from this, how we've got into this position, or how we've allowed ourselves to get into this position, how over the years why haven't we tackled this previously, and what could we have done differently so as we don't get into this sort of position again?
I think it's a very good question. Obviously, when you're in a situation, you want to be learning the lessons. My assessment of it would be it's symptomatic of the savings that the council's had to make over the last 10 years in terms of reducing the size of the establishment. And Thanet's not alone in it. Lots of councils find the situation in where there's been compound or accumulated salami slices to support services and departments across the organisation, where the organisation hasn't really stopped providing anything. We're just doing it with a smaller number of staff. We're still providing pretty much the same range of services that we were a decade ago, but with a much smaller staff cohort to deliver that. And what that does, it exposes us to risks. And that, unfortunately, this is the the manifestation of one of those risks in terms of the state of our property portfolio.
Councillor Towning.
I'd like to thank you for coming along today, Mark. It's a long overdue subject that we've wanted to address for some time. And it's a very important area of the income for the council. You know, it generates a well-being for the council to do a lot of other things. On the basis of the holding over of your leases, how many of them are historical to 2016? Do you know? And do you know whether they are retail or whether they are commercial offices, and what would be the new basis of your rent review on what is the market values that you're looking at per square footage on rental of on retail and on commercial marketplace of offices or likewise?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's a very broad portfolio. I would say that maybe 70% of those, if you want to call it arrears or lack of rent, are in the concessions side. Would you call that retail? But the beach concessions, we've been a bit slow on that. Difficult situation. We inherited Harbour Arm, as you know, that were just out of 13 properties, there were just 2 leases in place. So how would you go and put a rent review in if there's no lease in place? The tenants are resisting paying rent until we sort out issues with the toilets and with the roof and various other things. So it's a lot of time and effort for somebody to come in and sort that, just that little example out. So I would say it's largely, in terms of the arrears, the ones like Rob Yates' company is easy. That's on an indexation basis and is very straightforward. That's why Harbour Arm has less arrears than the general fund portfolio. It's more a market commentary than anything else. But if industrial's not seeing such a slowdown at all, so I think those rents are holding firm. The ones that are suffering are your out-and-out retail properties on high streets. People aren't coming in. COVID scuppered it. There's online trading. We're trying to regenerate areas, trying to get the Ramsgate market back up again, and we had a good meeting on that today with Laura and Steve Alban. But offices is an interesting one. If you've got car parking and they're well maintained and in a good location, I think there's still demand for those, although people are more comfortable with hybrid home working now. But the real, and there's quite a lot of demand for the beach concessions. There's quite an entrepreneurial culture here, and people want to have a go. But high street properties, of which we don't have too many, are a problem for everyone at the moment.
With regards to the toilets, it's a very personal thing for me because I look after, as much as Rob does as well. We have visitors, as you know, in the summer, and toilets are a massive issue throughout Thanet, And have you actually, are you going to organise a complete survey to get a schedule of works and then have them costed fairly urgently?
Beg your pardon? If you look on number A there, that's one survey. All 54 public toilets are being now about to be commissioned. We've gone through the procurement process, and that's a piece of work that is probably got three arms to it. There's a number of town councils who've expressed interest in taking back some toilets. There's potential for the beach-orientated toilets to go into one particular management, but we don't want to put them in there without saying, look, this is the outstanding repairs, this is what we expect within a period of time for them to be repaired. And then there will need to be a discussion about the inland, what I call the inland public toilets, about what we're going to do with them. But whether we put them on the open market, whether they go to town councils, or whether we continue to operate them. But you can't have a sensible conversation about that until you've got this costed survey back.
I appreciate that. The point is that if we look at toilets, all right, unless we're prepared to do the work to the toilets, we're going to find it very difficult to offload them. So are we going to do work to them, or are we just going to try and say to someone, well, we give you a period of rent-free to repair, and then thereafter, whatever the arrangements are. What have you got in mind?
It's okay, I'll take that question. To be honest, that's a whole separate piece of work. So, see, Mark's team in managing the property portfolio, the first question is to understand the condition of the assets, and so hence the purpose of this slide, tried to inform you all about the work that's going on to understand the condition of our assets. The potential options and future and range of things we might or could do with the toilets is a different thread of work, and Mark and I aren't really the right people to answer questions about that. And obviously it also includes issues about the cleaning of them, the supplies in them, the management of them, not just the condition. So they're much bigger, much more complex issues than just what the Mark's team are working on currently. Obviously, if this committee is interested in that, then I'm sure we could have conversations in the future as work progresses. But I don't think it's something that Mark and I can answer now.
Chair, if I may, I think obviously it's an interesting subject matter. I think it's important that we stay within the sort of the remit of this committee. That for me feels very much like a scrutiny topic where we're looking at sort of policy decisions and priorities for the organisation. What Mr Porter and Mr Peace have very well set out as the sort of the plans that we've got in place, the controls we've got in place to deliver the objectives of the council around the property portfolio, rather than stepping into the realms of which particular assets are we going to be looking to dispose of, which I think is a very worthwhile topic, but one I would suggest is more well suited for a scrutiny panel or a subgroup rather than Governance and Audit Committee.
Councillor Lees.
Thank you. Under A, on the condition and cost surveys, when are we likely to see the results of those surveys? And is it going to be a matter of East Pier, Ramsgate Harbour's taken first, and so on and so forth, or are they all being done at the same time?
East Pier, Ramsgate has been done. You know the condition of it is not great. But it's actually worse. Sorry, it looks worse than it is, because some of that concrete was taken off in order to view what was behind it, and so it hasn't actually fallen off. So we've commissioned that one. The Winter Gardens is an update one from previous surveys that were done, and you get that back in a couple of months. North Down House is about to be commissioned. We're taking that back off your leisure, as you know. Hartsdown and Ramsgate leisure centres have been done now, and they're going to form the schedule of condition and the works matrix with your leisure. The public toilets was effectively signed off today about who we're going to procurement process, and I would expect that the outcome, the costed condition schedule of that back at the end of January.
Sorry, just on that figure of the 54 public toilets.
Yeah.
Obviously, that can't be the sites themselves, is it? I mean, is that how many units there are?
No, not
total?
It's not cubicles. No, that is how many.
We've got 54 public toilet sites.
Yes.
My God.
It's probably worth saying that they're not all necessarily operational toilets, but they're buildings that are within our portfolio that are operational toilets or previously were operational toilets, or but they're not all necessarily operational at this point.
We talked about, you raised this issue about the toilets. Now, what are you laughing at? In the summer, I raised the issue about the toilets, and I was told there was a review being taken by Councillor Cupp at the time. Have you seen that review?
Myself, personally, I've not seen the review, but I can't comment on the sort of the existence or the progress that's been made of the review. That's something you'd have to take up with Councillor Cupp, I'm afraid.
Because do you realise this is the third review? Ash Ashby, when she was in office in 19, had a review. Then Steve Auburn came along, he had a review, and now we've got another review. I mean, we need to really push and find out where we are with these reviews. Chair?
I do believe, Councillor Townend, that there was a request at the latest Other and Scrutiny panel meeting that was for Councillor Cupp to present to the next ONS meeting, if not the next one, the one after that. So I do believe that that will probably be the best forum to have that discussion. But moving on to Councillor Yates.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Mark, for that presentation. I think hopefully speak for everyone here where I say welcome the transparency and the openness around it. It's refreshing to see that level of detail about this issue. Just a few questions. So is there any way that we as councillors and members can keep our eye on this issue? Because I know when I was in Cabinet, I was asking for updates and not getting it. But is there any way to see how many rent reviews have we done on time per quarter and keep those metrics? That's my first question. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm trying to produce that. I mean, being relatively new and so short-staffed, it's been quite a work of art to get to this level. Now it's a kind of allocation and prioritisation. I hate the term low-hanging fruit, but it is prudent in this instance to do that. But we've now just about got, with 4 experienced asset surveyors, enough to hold the general day-to-day management. It's these 2 interim surveyors that we're out in the market for at the moment who are going to really accelerate the rent reviews, because they've got a lot of tenant issues that they're having to deal with. So I would think, we hope, that from the end of this financial year to be able to come back with meaningful data that's relevant without giving away what our interpretation of ERV is. We're in the middle of a negotiation. We've got to be a little bit careful about that. And we're also quite sensitive, and I know when we meet with Councillor Saunders too, that this is quite a tough time for retailers coming out of COVID and now coming into the cost of living crisis. And we're trying to encourage enterprise and employment. And that's another reason I don't really want to go back 6 years on a rent review for somebody who's just trying to break even at the moment. So in answer to your question, yes, but not down to, look, that person's paying £5,500 per annum, and we're going to go after them for £7,500. But to say, the last quarter there were 200 outstanding, and we've now completed in that quarter 50 or whatever that thing. Certainly I can do that.
Yeah, and that's the very high level overview, I think, which would be really useful because. That's
relatively straightforward. Yeah.
Yeah, perfect. And yeah, just going on to the point of, obviously you need resource to be able to do just that kind of level of additional work. So yeah, I for one welcome the hiring of these additional posts, and it's about time, in my opinion, that this happened. It's something that I was pushing for years, and it was a bit like slamming my head against a brick wall, to be honest, trying to get that. Which leads me on to my second question. So when we did take in the harbour arm, which you mentioned, I was kind of hoping that we could use that additional monies for the estates team and hiring more people. But I think at the time we were told that it has to fill a budget black hole. Is it now the case that some of these estate incomes can be used for the staff, additional staff? Thanks.
I'll take that question. Ultimately, the decision about where resources in the budget are allocated is a decision for full council to make, and for Cabinet to recommend to full council what that might look like for next year. We've done a lot of work in supporting Chris and his team in finance, putting together the draft budget for next year. And that specifically includes appraisal about the potential increases in rent income from the portfolio and how we might use that to support the property service. So, ultimately, whether that money is ring-fenced for that purpose or not is a decision for council. But the proposals that we've been working on and subject to agreement at Cabinet and subsequently coming on to council, that will include the resourcing of the team that we think we need to be able to deliver this effectively. So certainly for next year, realistically, the best we could hope for is that is cost neutral. But in the longer term, we do think there's potential for some resources that could be freed back to the wider objectives of the authority.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Bob, and thank you, Mark. I think that's from my feedback is really positive. Step forward. Thanks.
Yeah. So I realise there's a government's an audit, and we've got statutory compliance duties and everything. But rightly so, the salaries that we've put forward for 23-24 should be cost neutral with this additional rental income that we've got in, and the immediate focus is on the rent orientation and some of the disposal surveyors for the capital receipts for repairs and maintenance. But the additional money that we get in when we get closer to that 800, 900,000 figure is for people to do further work on statutory compliance, project managers, decarbonisation officers, and more compliance and audit data management work.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, members, for your comments. I think the higher level analysis would be really useful. Perhaps we could have an update in 6 to 9 months when you're kind of in full swing. That gives a good couple of quarters' work. That would be great. The recommendation is that the Governance and Audit Committee notes and makes comments on the appropriate of this update. Please can I have a proposer and a seconder. Proposed by Councillor Townend, seconded by Councillor Yates. Unless I hear any objection, I will take this as approved. Perfect, thank you. Moving on to agenda item 5, we were due an ICT security update by Dan Evans, the officer. Unfortunately, he can't make it tonight due to illness. We will be moving this item to the next meeting, but Chris, did you want to do any sort of brief?
I can give a very... Sorry, Chair. I can give a very quick overview of where we are with it. Dan has provided me with a note. I believe the update, Councillor Lees, I think this came from a question you raised a couple committees back around the additional risks around home working of officers. So Dan Evans is our head of ICT within the shared service that we've got with Canterbury and Dover. So Dan has set up the main sort of the additional risks that we've got working at home compared to a traditional office environment. They're mainly around physical controls rather than technical controls. And what I mean by that are things like machines being left unlocked or officers having sight of confidential information that may be on a screen, people they may live with, or devices being at windows that people can pass by. And then the more technical aspect of that is around home Wi-Fi not being secure enough because of the security that people got in place. We do have some technical controls in place that help combat that. We use Citrix for a lot of our operations that puts an additional layer of security in place. We've got a single sign-on now solution in place called Okta, which effectively means officers only have to put passwords in once. So when we're talking about people seeing screens, there's reduced risk of that because an officer's only putting a password in once. Multi-factor authentication, and then the council's general network is very well protected in terms of the firewalls that we've got in place. So over and above those controls, the digital team that Hannah Thorpe, Director of Comms, heads up, are working alongside ICT colleagues to look at trying to get some information and further training out to staff to try and, because a lot of it actually is fairly standard, you know, the low-hanging fruit stuff that we've been hearing around earlier. But in this context, cyber risk, people just, it can be mass attacks, people brute force attacks, people trying to spam their way in, getting hold of people to click on links, all that kind of stuff. So there's some awareness training that we're going to be running with staff to make sure that they're vigilant and looking out for those typical types of risks, not clicking on links in the emails. So that is ongoing. The other thing I can say in terms of security is there was a decision taken to keep the ICT security team in place for the next year. So you may be aware that the ICT service is being brought back in-house. The shared service has been disbanded, but the actual security team is going to remain for one further year as a shared service, just while those teams establish themselves in-house to give ourselves a little bit more resilience, because you don't want to effectively change too many things at one time. But it's one of those things, it's an evolving landscape. As you put more controls in place, the cyber criminals, they become more sophisticated and try and top trump those controls that we're putting in place. But it's something that's high on our risk register and we continue to monitor. But Dan will be well placed to add more detail. That's just a very brief update he's able to give me. He's happy to come along to the next committee if you still want to hear from him.
Perfect. Moving on to agenda item 6, the quarterly internal audit update report. Simon Webb will introduce the report.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, members. This is our regular quarterly internal audit update report summarising the work undertaken by the East Kent Audit Partnership on your behalf, together with the performance of the partnership to the 30th of September. If I could draw your attention to the table on page 13, that summarises the 4 new audits completed during this quarter. We're very pleased to conclude substantial assurance in the areas of HMO and selective licensing. Credit to Bob's team and in particular Richard Hopkins there. Substantial assurance with no recommendations for improvement, pretty much as good as it gets in terms of audit assurance. Payroll, staff are undoubtedly your biggest asset, and of course the salary bill is one of your largest areas of expenditure. So very pleased to report substantial assurance over the internal controls in the payroll system. We concluded reasonable assurance in the area of digital and cloud computing, obviously an emerging issue within most organisations. And we also concluded reasonable assurance in the area of waste vehicle fleet management. So that covers things like the MOT and servicing of your refuse freighters and associated vehicles. Follow-up is a very important part of audit work. We don't just take management's word for it that they've implemented recommendations. We go back typically about 3 months later and undertake a follow-up review. We've heard a great deal this evening about rent reviews and commercial let properties. I was just looking back to see when we last audited that, and it was actually in October 21, and we concluded limited assurance and highlighted the backlog of rent reviews, EPCs, lack of KPIs. The follow-up was undertaken in April 22, again with limited assurance. So that was reported to this committee. I'm very pleased to hear from Bob and Mark this evening that improvements are now starting to take place. So follow-up is a very important part of our work. During this quarter, we completed 6 follow-ups, and they're detailed in the table on page 17 and page 18. One area of concern is cash collection. You'll see on page 17 that at the time of the original audit, we concluded limited assurance. Unfortunately, after follow-up, that was still limited assurance. One of the appendices to this report is recommendations outstanding after follow-up. That's on page 25 and over the page onto page 26. Unfortunately, you can see from that that we've struggled to get management response both at the time of the original audit and indeed the follow-up. So there are control weaknesses there, and we're not receiving much in the way of management assurance. We don't have the relevant director here this evening, but it is an area of concern that needs to be addressed by this council. In terms of progress against the plan, the agreed 22-23 internal audit plan, that's detailed in the table on page 21 and subsequent pages. Pleased to report that as at 30th of September, we had completed 41.75% of the agreed plan, slightly below the 50% half-year target. I can update, though, that we ran the figures at close of play today, and against the 8-month target of 66%, we were up to 64% completion. So we're well on target for very healthy plan completion by 31st of March next year, all being well. Other appendices to the report, page 28, that shows the areas where we've concluded limited or no assurance as part of previous original audits, and we've yet to go back and do the follow-up. Most of those are work in progress, things such as CCTV, tenancy and estate management, repairs and maintenance, Thanet community, lotto. So they should be coming forward to, in the case of all 4 of those, the March meeting, which I think is 8th of March next year. Final appendix to this report is a balanced scorecard of key performance indicators for the East Kent Audit Partnership. I mentioned probably the most important one of those, which is plan completion. And as I say, we are showing very healthy progress against that. It also shows details about time spent on staff training, continuous professional development, and also as part of each audit we undertake a client satisfaction questionnaire, and the details of those satisfaction questionnaires are detailed on page 30. That concludes my presentation, Chair. I'm happy to take questions on any of the issues raised from members. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Straight over to Councillor Whitehead.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much for this report. It's just a request for further detail, really, in relation to one of the follow-up reviews. So with electoral registration and election management, we've moved from original assurance level of reasonable to a revised level of reasonable, but obviously we have significant changes coming up this May. And I think currently 45% of councils are expressing significant concern as to how that will be managed. So I was wondering if there's any information in relation to how those changes are going to impact and what has been addressed within the follow-up. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Obviously, any internal audit is generally a backward look at the systems of internal control, in this case covering both electoral registration and election management at the time of the audit. I think it probably would need an update in terms of the changes moving forward, either from the Democratic Services Manager or perhaps the Monitoring Officer.
Councillor Yates.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, thanks for the report. Just two questions. First one on, you mentioned the cash collection being a, what is, you mentioned the control measures being the kind of issue with the cash collection. What are the implications of that? For example, is it there a risk that some of the money is disappearing and going missing? So what's the kind of worst case situation there if we don't resolve it? And the second question, on some positive news, you didn't mention the food safety has gone from substantial to no assurance to substantial assurance, which I think is very good news. So I just don't know if you've got any comments there, and a bit of background there would be good. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor. In terms of cash collection, there was quite a significant lack of information being provided by the cash collector, particularly in terms of pull tickets from machines. Whenever a cash machine is opened, it automatically produces a ticket that tells you how much money should be in the box. If you're not checking the sequential run of those tickets, you don't know if those boxes are being pulled in between and money being taken out. You also don't know if the money in the box that is being counted and banked for you by the collector is everything that is due to you. So yes, there is a potential for money to go missing, undoubtedly. Because those tickets have now arrived. Unfortunately, they've all arrived all at once, months and months worth of them. It's a job that if you keep on top of on a daily basis, it's fairly straightforward. Not the most interesting job, but it is an important job. To suddenly be inundated with a mountain of paperwork undoubtedly would put pressure on the teams to process. There's also some VAT implications in terms of how the income has been coded due to lack of information from the cash collector. VAT status of on-street car parking and off-street car parking are different. It is important that we code it and separate it correctly. Thank you for reminding me about food safety. Yeah, very positive improvement there by the food safety team. Virtually everything was substantial at the time of the original audit. The area that was no assurance was related to GDPR. Basically, it was a software issue that prevented them from deleting old records in accordance with their retention schedule, largely outside of our team's control within the council. That has now been rectified, and so everything else has moved up to substantial assurance. Thank you.
Thanks.
Chris, you want to say something?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, and thank you for that, Simon. I just wanted to add a little bit more context just from the service. Fortunately, Penny Button, the service director, can't be here tonight. She's not available. She's been unwell, even though she has been at work, but she's not able to make the meeting this evening because of ill health. So I think it's important to just understand the context of how this happened, cash collection. So the previous supplier that we used for cash collection, they went into administration without notice. We just were told pretty much the next day that they weren't going to be emptying the parking machine boxes or collecting any cash. So we had to put some temporary measures in place, and they ran for some time. That took quite an effort from colleagues within parking and financial services. We, as part of a Kent-wide consortium, we have now got a contract in place with a new supplier for cash collections, not just parking, it's our other satellite offices as well, so the crematorium, the Port and Harbour, for example. However, I think, without being trying to be too critical, the supplier has struggled to meet the expectations of the contract as set out in Simon's report. We are working closely with them to reconcile those issues with the cash collection. As Simon said, we've got a big box of receipts that we now need to go through. But in terms of it's set out in the report that the management response has not been timely. I think we acknowledge that. That's something we've slipped on, but there has been a real deficit of staffing in parking. The two most senior managers within that area have been on maternity leave, leaving a real shortage of management there, and obviously you'd be well aware of the shortage of management and the interim arrangement we've had at corporate management level, and we are trying to address them as best we can, but unfortunately some things have slipped because of the availability of staff resources.
Can I just quickly come back? Yeah, thanks for that update, Chris. I think I probably speak for everyone here when I say it would be good to know full stop that we are on top of it, it's like from a certain date forward. I think the historical review is one piece of work that needs doing, but we probably need to know on a month-by-month basis, are we now on top of it, and do we have any risks of money going missing?
From what we can see, we don't think the issues are substantial, but there still may be some reconciliation to be done. That doesn't. Obviously, we want our controls to be absolutely watertight, but happy to bring this back. Obviously, we've had a follow-up, and it's still at limited. I don't want to put words in the committee's mouth, but it's for you to decide as to how you'd wish for this to be progressed. Sorry, Stephen, did you?
Councillor Garner.
Thank you. Yeah, well, firstly, I'd like to thank you and recognise what you said about the fact that you had in your report previously highlighted the issues around the corporate property that we had earlier, and I don't think any of us mentioned that during that debate, so thank you for that. It sort of highlights the value of your update every quarter. The question I wanted to ask about the update you gave tonight related to the HMO substantial assurance, which I think we all agree is really good to hear. One of the points, in fact the final bullet point, you mention that there are arrangements in place to ensure that unlicensed HMOs are identified and appropriate action taken. And I just wondered if you or Mr. Porter were able to let us know how many have been identified in the last period, maybe the last year or last couple of years, and what action has been taken on those occasions. Thank you.
I'm afraid I don't have that information with me to hand, but I can get that from the team. So both the numbers and the specific actions that the team have taken. On actions, I think what I can say is that the enforcement protocol that the private sector housing team work by includes both informal action in the first instance, and we would always seek to resolve issues informally, and then formal action across the range of powers that are available to the council under various legislation. So informal action obviously is us speaking to the owner and saying this is a premises that needs to be licensed, please submit your application, and then if they don't submit their application we would consider appropriate enforcement action. But I'll get the numbers for you.
Yeah, thank you, that'd be great. I mean, it's not an urgent query, I was just interested to know. Thank you very much.
Councillor Yates.
Yeah, sorry, just following up on the cash collection point, and I think the mention of a recommendation. Is it, from my side, I'd like to propose that we do have considering there are discrepancies of 15k and the cash collection is limited assurance, if we could have an update on that at the next meeting, I think that would be sensible, if anyone wants to second.
Yep, very much. That's literally what my notes just said as well, so we're on the same path. And I think that was seconded by Councillor Lees. Perfect. Are there any other comments or questions to make? No. Perfect. The recommendation is that the report be received by members, that members consider where appropriate requesting an update from the relevant director as discussed to the next meeting of the committee in respect of any areas identified as still having either limited or no assurance after follow-up. Please have a proposer and a seconder. Proposed by Councillor Lees, seconded by Councillor Hopkinson. Unless I hear any objection, I will take this as approved. Perfect. Moving on to agenda item 7 is risk management. Chris Blundell will now introduce this report.
Thank you, Chair. And firstly, I just wanted to start offering my apologies to councillors for the late circulation of this supplementary agenda item, which is the Annex 1 to the report that sets out the risks that score more or score less than 8 or more after mitigation, but not on the main corporate risk register. The reason for the delay is, as Amy, our insurance and risk officer, reported at the last committee meeting, we've undertaken and implemented a new approach to risk management. What that resulted in was a lot more risk coming forward onto the corporate risk register for our review. Subsequently, that needed a lot more officer attention and scrutiny to make sure the way we were presenting those risks were fit for public consumption, because some of those risks are fairly serious in nature, even after mitigation, and we wanted to make sure anything out there couldn't be misconstrued or sensationalised or spun in any way that could be detrimental to the organisation. So that's the reason for the time delay. So if I can just take you through the main reports, the quarterly update to risk management. If you turn to page 34, this is a new edition. You'll see some quite colourful tables on the charts presented there on page 34 and page 35. It gives a little bit more information about how we arrived at the scores that you've been previously presented in risk management reports before. So the first table sets out how we arrive at different likelihood scores. So how probable is it something's going to happen, all the way down from a low score of 1 if it's rare, up to very likely if you get the tracks that score at 4. There's a bit of a description there as to where and when we think it would attract those scores. The following table below that at 3.8 sets out the impact that might happen if one of those risks did happen. So all the way at the top you've got severe down to minor, and the different sets of headings of the types of risks impact for the organisation, whether it's reputational, strategic, well-being, impact on service delivery, finance or compliance. So to give you just a flavour at that, so looking at the finance, the one I'm obviously most familiar with, if a risk happened, then it would mean that we'd lose more than £500,000, we class that as severe, so it get full marks, all the way down if the risk was less than £50,000, if the risk actually happened, we'd only give it a score. So we then take those two scores we applied, so for impact and likelihood, and we times them, so with the product of the two numbers, and then we map that out in the table on page 35 under section 3.9. That gets the risk scores. So we show you in this report the scores that are extreme. So we consider these are extreme risks to the council. So in that red zone, top right hand corner, risk rating 12 or 16. So that means they've got a likelihood of likely or very likely, and they've got an impact of significant or severe. So actually looking at the risks themselves, set out on page 37, I think there was a question, I can't remember from which councillor a while back ago, when are we ever going to see one of these risks go down? It might have been you, Councillor Garner. I'm pleased to report you can see there are a few risks that have gone down now. Starting with the obvious, COVID-19, although we are aware of it and it is a risk that, looking at the matrix, we consider could be high, some may even say moderate. It's not an extreme risk to us anymore just because of the way the pandemic has developed, and we've now entered into epidemic territory. The other two risks that reduce are political stewardship. That's partly due to the success of cross-party working that we've seen throughout the last period of, pretty much throughout this whole 4 years. I think that we've had this council in place, but also the fact that we're pretty close to the elections now. It's highly unlikely we're going to see a change of leadership in the next 5 months, although I may be counting chickens or holding my breath too soon. That one may come back to bite me, and Ash won't thank me for it. But the organisation is a bit more of a stable place. We've not had a change of leadership for a while, and given the upcoming elections, a change of leadership is less likely. There are some new risks on here. That's because of, partly because of the way we've been approaching the risk management process, but actually just because some of these risks have arisen. So looking at corporate risk number 19, EPC, energy performance certificates, it's very much linked to the topic that Mark covered earlier in terms of rental income that we can get. We need to make sure that our properties that we're renting out have appropriate energy performance certificates in place, and that they are performing at that level. Otherwise, we're not able to generate a rental income. So that obviously presents a finance, also a service provision potentially, and a reputational risk to us. And then the other new risks that we've got on the Manston Road building, there was an Environment Agency inspection there, sets out some of the, just a bit more detail there on page 42, 5.9. In its extremis, the worst case scenario here would be that the depot potentially could be shut if the Environment Agency thought it wasn't fit to happen. We're not at that territory. That's you can see the likelihoods at 3. I wouldn't say that it's likely. That is the most extreme risk. What we're actually looking at is possible disruption to it if we're not able to address some of the impacts or the concerns that the EA have raised around the site. We've already addressed a number of them, and we've got a deadline to address the remainder of those by the end of, or close to the end of this calendar year, and we are working through those. But it is a risk that is only appropriate that we flag to this committee, because if we weren't able to meet those conditions, obviously worst case scenario, the depot could be closed down. I'm not professing in any certainty or with any expectation that that is going to happen. I think we've got the measures in place to avoid that happening, but it is a risk that the committee, given its terms of reference, should have presented to it. And then the other risk that is new is on our net zero strategy. This is a risk that we're not able to meet the commitments that we've set out in terms of our climate change pledge, and also the ambitions and commitments that we've made within our net zero strategy. There are a number of mitigating actions that we've got in that, but to meet them, we are very much reliant on external funding being made available to us across a number of our service areas and initiatives where we're looking to move to low carbon delivery. I mean, Mr. Porter will be well aware in terms of what we're looking to do with our housing stock in terms of transitioning to net zero. We do need external funding, match funding to come in order for us to meet the objectives we've got and the timeline and deadlines we've got for the 2030 net zero for our own TDC emissions, let alone the wider district emissions by 2050. I don't intend to go through all the risks that are on the annex. We'll be here for quite some time. All the risks that haven't changed. I appreciate the committee has been going for some time already, but of course I'm happy to take any questions on any of the risks that I've gone through or any of the risks that are on the paperwork that you've had presented to you.
Councillor Garner.
Thank you. Thanks for the update, Chris. And I'll join you in celebrating the reduction in a couple of those risks after the last couple of years. One thing that, I mean, obviously there is those the table of the risk scores links to a bigger spreadsheet containing each of those risks, and each of those highlights the type of risk they are, whether they be finance, compliance, or whichever. It might help us, I think, just looking at this. But if there was some way of highlighting in each of the risks with a single letter for
Yeah, we could do that.
reputation or strategic?
Yeah,
so
we can add
what
a
to
key or some other form of indicating, or just set out in the narrative the type of risk to
Yeah,
make it a bit
that'd
clearer
be-
to the committee.
That'd be helpful.
Not a problem.
Thank you.
Councillor Yates.
Thanks, Chair. Just question on the homelessness risk, just because the director's in the room and I thought I could might squeeze some more information out. Do we know the current number of households living in temporary accommodation, and is this the highest on record, or how are we looking in comparison with historical figures on that? And do you think that we can get any progress with, this is it is related to the risk, is that KCC are currently auctioning off some of their housing property, and it seems nonsensical to me, is if we had an East Kent authority, we wouldn't have we could use that property ourselves as TDC, as opposed to our current situation where KCC are auctioning off property, which we could be using for temporary accommodation. So I don't know if there's any comments on that at all. Thanks.
So on the first question, we've got a weekly sheet that the team complete, so I've always got figures kind of within a week of any point. So the latest update I've got is 197, so slightly down from the highest point, but still clearly not where we want it to be. We were up in the 190s previously, about 3 years ago, just before the implementation of the Homelessness Reduction Act. And then the strategy following the implementation of that new legislation was very much about investing in homelessness prevention, and it saw some great success in getting the numbers down. And then we've seen this latest spike really following seen the issues in the report related to COVID, changing patterns of where people live and where they work, changing behaviour of landlords, leaving the sector, either selling or moving into short-term let, and cost of living issues and rent increases. And actually I see in the latest budget announcements from government, there was announcements about benefits increasing with the rate of inflation, but what government haven't done is change the local housing allowance rate. And you'd think that would have also been increased in line with the inflation in the private rented sector, but it absolutely hasn't, and that is going to make it even more challenging. It's always disappointing to see another public sector body put housing assets or land to the market without consulting us, and I think we would always want to have a conversation with our public sector partners about how we might work together on some of those on assets like that, and particularly housing accommodation, leaving the affordable sector and going into the market. Clearly we want to talk about that, and our housing strategy team would be happy to work with the county, housing associations, other public sector partners that maybe have got accommodation that doesn't suit their needs and they want to dispose of. We'd be happy to have a conversation about that. We don't currently have any acquisitions money in the approved budget, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we couldn't do more acquisitions in the future. We have used some of the development programme money for acquisitions and refurbishment. At the moment it's all committed to new build programmes we've got in train, but clearly we could allocate in the future further resources for acquisitions.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions? Councillor Towning.
With regards to housing associations, Almost is the major housing association in this area, but are there any other housing associations that you work with in the area that could have property that we could actually get hold of for the homeless? Are you aware?
I'm not aware of others that are disposing of housing stock. We know that Orbit have been disposing of housing stock mostly where their surveyors have assessed that it was too expensive to improve the energy rating of those dwellings. I'm not sure that position really solves the problem, because you end up with a poor performing dwelling in the private sector rather than in the housing association sector, so I'm not sure it helps. But obviously the decision making is a matter for them. We certainly would be happy to talk about considering acquiring some of those if our programme permitted it. I was going to say I think we have taken some units from Orbit, but I'd need to check that. We've got other active associations in the area. So Riverside Housing Association, Southern Housing, Town and Country Housing, Amicus, all have got developments and properties in the area. I'm not aware of any of those others that have had disposal strategies.
Any other comments or questions from the panel? No? Great. Chris, just on the Manston Road depot, obviously that's quite a significant risk going forward. Would it be possible to request an update in a future meeting? Just sort of we can make use of having risks highlighted to us, really, and then we can kind of keep track on them.
Yeah, just I think that's a good idea. Just for a little bit more context around that risk, I probably should have set out the Environment Agency has a grading in terms of how serious their concerns are. 1 being the worst, 4 being it's a bit iffy. We're at 3, so we're certainly at not at 1. If it was a 1, they're coming in and shutting the organisation down, all the way down to 4. So we're not at the top of the scale. I just wanted to sort of stress that, but they obviously do have some concerns around the operation at the depot. But I'm happy to invite the service director to the next meeting to give you an update.
Cool. So the recommendation is to approve the review of corporate risks and discuss the annex risks, and obviously the recommendation as well to invite the service director at a later meeting. Please can I have a proposer and a seconder to approve the review. Proposed by Councillor Duckworth, seconded by Councillor Shrub. Unless I hear any objection, I will take this as approved. Great, that is approved. Moving on to agenda item 8, it's the mid-year review for 2022 to 23, Treasury Management and Annual Investment Strategy, and we're going back to Chris Blondell.
Thank you. Right, so we've got 2 Treasury Management items between us and the end of this meeting, so I'll try and keep it swift. Right, firstly, also because this paper's already been to Cabinet, went to Cabinet on the 17th of November, presented by Councillor David Saunders. Just some quick highlights for your attention. So this is a backward look to the mid-year point of the current financial year. At that point, we had £20 million worth of external borrowing on our books. We didn't take out any further borrowing during the first half of the year, but we paid off 169,000, so that's reducing slowly. Looking at the second half of this financial year, we'll continue to monitor our options for borrowing, but it's unlikely that we will borrow given existing market conditions. Other side of that, in terms of treasury management, is usually around investment. So our investment balances are high. They're at £57 million at the moment, which is really high. That's largely because we've got some grant funding, Margate Town Deal, levelling up money that's come in advance of us spending it. That will whittle down over the next few years. That is as set out in the next financial report that I've got on treasury management. There's a few techie things in here about lease arrangements and lease accounting, which is horribly boring and horribly technical, and I won't go through in any detail, but I'm always available to answer questions on it if anyone has any trouble getting to sleep. The final thing I need to report, minor breach on our investment limits. So we have a £6 million limit that we can have an investment with one particular counterparty, one investment at any one time. There was an issue where the interest that we received from, we'd maxed out the limits. We had 6 million invested with a particular investment, and instead of them paying the interest to our bank account, they stuck it on the investment balance. So it went over it by £4,385 between the 1st of June and the 8th of June. We said, don't do it again, that's difficult for us. They did it again between the 1st of July and the 4th of July, and we had £5,335 excess, so that we're hoping that third time lucky they've got the message and it's not going to happen again. These obviously are relatively minor breaches, given we've got £6 million with it, and they're internally set limits, but they're still ones that I need to report. If it was to happen again, we would stop dealing with that counterparty effectively. That's it on that item. Happy to take any questions.
Members, any comments? Councillor Lees.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Just on that last point, I suppose talk about the repercussions of if that breach happened again. Is the repercussion that we wouldn't deal with that?
Effectively. There's no repercussions in terms of us being fined or subject to any sanctions because they're internally set limits. We could say, actually, we're going to have, it's all depending on our risk appetite and how much we're willing to. So we've got £57 million that we can invest. We're saying we're only going to stick £6 million with one party. If you really liked it, the committee went, do you know what, we're going to, in our next report, Treasury Management Strategy, you can go, no limit, stick whatever you want. I could have put £57 million with one counterparty. Obviously, that is high risk, because if that counterparty goes belly up, you've lost all your cash. Typically, we only invest with very high-grade investments anyway, so that risk is low. What it means is we've breached the limits that are set out in the strategy, so I've got a obligation and a requirement to report that back to this committee as the committee that's responsible for, well, ultimately advising council as to what those limits should be. It's the breach of our own reporting limits, but in practical terms, if it happens again, we won't deal with that counterparty.
When was the limit last reviewed?
It's reviewed annually, and that's in this next report.
Councillor Hopkinson.
Thank you, Chair. Just on this, I didn't know the term is a counterparty.
Yeah,
I didn't know that term.
Sorry, it's
no, that's all right, yeah.
jargonish term.
That's
apologies.
Okay. Because I was wondering if, because I was under the impression in the last meeting we said we'd be able to have a look at what those investments are.
Yes, my apologies. I can circulate that to the committee and bring it to the next meeting.
Yeah, okay. Okay, that's fine.
Okay, thank you, Councillor.
If there's no further comments, the recommendation is that the committee notes and makes comments on it as appropriate, the report and annexes. And I think recommends this report and annexes, including the prudential and treasury indicators that are shown and the proposed changes to the 2022-23 Treasury Management Strategy statement to Council for approval, and obviously the recommendation for Chris to come back at the next meeting to talk about the investments. Please can I have a proposer and a seconder to approve the review. Proposed by Councillor Hopkinson, seconded by Councillor Yates. Unless I hear any objection, I will take this as approved. Cool. Moving swiftly on to agenda item 9, draft Treasury Management Strategy Statement, minimum revenue provision policy statement and annual investment strategy for 2023 to 24. That's a bit of a mouthful. Introducing Chris Blundell.
Thank you, Chair. So this is the forward look. This is the annual review that we've got as an opportunity to change some of those limits or other approaches that we want to take. Unfortunately, this is still in draft form, but I didn't want to not bring it to this committee and give you the opportunity to talk to it. The reason for that is that the next time this committee meets in March, this strategy will have been formally approved by Council. So Council has the ultimate responsibility, but I wanted to share the form that it's in at the moment for you to give you, the committee, the opportunity to ask me any questions about just our Treasury Management Strategy in general. Just some headlines coming out of it. We're going to spend a lot of money over the next few years, and that's going to need to be financed appropriately. So you can even see, in terms of our capital expenditure, just page 71, right at the bottom, key reporting items to include £92 million capital expenditure over the next 3 years. That's a huge sum of cash, largely or pretty much evenly split between the HRA and the general fund. That split is set out on page 76 under section 2.1, and you can see the amounts that we'll be spending across the general fund and the HRA. So looking at the general fund next year, a lot of that money, the £30 million, is associated with the regen works that we're doing, town deal, levelling up, that kind of thing. HRA, Mr. Porter would be a better place to speak it, but there's lots of improvements we're doing around fire safety and other improvements to the tower block works. But you can see there's 92 million totals up from 23-24 across those 3 years. That's in addition to a budget of £51 million in 22-23. And what I can say from Q1 monitoring of the current year, we've not got on with spending that money as well as we would have liked to have done. So it's likely the majority of that is going to be slipped into next year. So the reality is when this is properly set, we're probably looking at spending in excess of having planned expenditure plans, in excess of £100 million for the next 3 years on the capital programme, which is quite significant, to say the least. So the table below that on page 76 just sets out the sources of that funding. You can see there's a lot of money there. Grants and other contributions to the general fund, £24 million, as I mentioned. It's mainly related to the Levelling Up programme, to regen works. And then we've got reserves on the HRA, £16 million. That's money that's already set aside for the programme of works I was talking about earlier. Then the bottom line talks about the amount of money that still needs to be financed over that period of time. You've got £25 million, so we're going to need to find borrowing effectively to fund that, either using our internal resources or going out to the market to do that. In terms of some context then, there's a nice jazzy chart on page 78, this pie chart here. I'll try and make this a little simpler. So if you consider this chart a bit like your own property that you may or may not own, or let's say a hypothetical property, its total value is the whole circle. The blue bit is the revaluation reserve. That's the increase in value of your property since you bought it. So since we bought our properties, they've gone up in value equal to the amount, because half the value of all our properties is revaluation gains. And then the red bit that's labelled CA8, that's effectively the mortgage element you paid off. And the yellow bit is the mortgage you've still got left to pay. So we've got 18% of our mortgage still outstanding against the value of our properties. We were looking to do a remortgage, go to a broker. If we were doing it all in one go, which of course we don't, you'd say we've got an 18% loan to value in terms of the value of our assets and the value of the borrowing that we need to take out. Looking at the table on the top of page 79, you see those investment balances I was talking about being around £51 million. For the end of last year, they're a bit higher mid-year, as I just mentioned in the previous report. Looking forward across the medium term, we think that's going to drop. As I said, we'll be using some reserves, some grants will be used up. We're going to look to maintain investment balances around about £35 million, but that may change depending on whether we decide to borrow externally or use our own cash balances to fund our investments that I was talking about. No change to the minimum revenue provision, which I won't go through because it's another really techie thing, but happy to take any questions on it at a later date. And then you'll see throughout the rest of the report, there's some bits highlighted in yellow. That's because, and it says link view of rescheduling to be inserted here or otherwise. Link are our Treasury Management Advisors, and we're still waiting on that piece of documentation to be provided to us. So unfortunately the report still is largely in draft, but there are some key messages I can sort of take out in terms of our trend, our strategy, our overall approach for managing our capital expenditure, our borrowing requirements over the next few years. But this report will be going to Cabinet in January and then to Council in February for approval alongside the overall budget. But happy to take any questions. Love to hear your feedback of anything you'd like us to consider, and I can take that away with the portfolio holder in terms of preparing the overall strategy for Cabinet and Council's consideration.
Councillor Towning.
Looking at these figures, 92 million and 24 million over a period of 23-26, we just listened to the Director of Property, where he's also looking to increase his requirements of expenditure. And there's no guarantee that from what he wants to do with the reviews and so forth, that he'll be able to fund what he really is after. Are we being prudish about taking so much commitment on, bearing in mind the global situation as we sit in this world today, not looking very healthy?
So it's a very good question. Some of it will be built into here already because we have within our capital plans planned maintenance that we have every year that we are going to spend on our assets. What we have seen is, unfortunately, in recent years, that hasn't been fully spent, both in terms of revenue and capital budgets. That's largely linked to the staffing restrictions that Mark Peace was referring to earlier. It's not necessarily because the finances haven't been available to deliver those schemes of work. The staffing haven't been there to deliver it. To give you an example, in terms of our reactive repairs budget, that was reduced by £100,000 about 2 or 3 years ago because they weren't spending the budget. Although we know there's a need for it, it's not prudent to set a budget that you know is not going to get spent because effectively you're charging the council taxpayer to raise a budget that you know is not going to get spent. We've got reserves set aside for some of that as well, but that doesn't dismiss the need to spend some of that money. What I am hoping as Section 151 officer to finance a lot of those capital works that Mark Peace has referred to, we're going to be able to get on with disposing some of our surplus assets that we don't need anymore or that we're not best placed to use. There's an organisation, whether it's a community organisation or a private sector organisation that's better placed to run and use that asset. We can sell those assets and then we can use those receipts to invest back into our stock rather than having to undertake additional borrowing, because as you said, it's not the best time to be taking on additional debt at this moment of time. We will because of the increase in interest rates. So our strategy remains that we will look to use internal borrowing. So that's our own cash balances that we've got. Take advantage of that rather than having to go out to the markets and look to take on further debt.
Okay. Councillor Yates.
Thanks for this, Chris, and thanks for the opportunity to suggest improvements. I'm just concerned potentially around the point around ethical investment. Doesn't seem to be particularly substantial, I would say. It feels no. I don't know how true this is. It feels that it's a bit of kind of lip service. So it'd be interesting to know more about how, like, ethical investment, taking into account when we are investing our cash into funds, are we ensuring they're not invested in fossil fuels, and whether this could even extend as far as the council's pensions. But I know that's managed by KCC, so it's not potentially relevant. But if you could potentially flesh out how that paragraph about ethical investing will flow through. Thanks.
Yeah, happy to take that away. We can have some further conversations as part of our conversations with the portfolio holder about that. What I would say around ethical, or ESG, as it referred to, ethical, social and governance based investments. It's something we look to do, but the framework that we operate, the Prudential Code and the Treasury Management Code, dictates that we have to prioritise security, liquidity and yield when we're looking to place our money. So although we want to consider those investments, when I'm looking at it, if I've got something that looks better from those three pillars, that's what, from a Treasury Management perspective, we are bound to sort of consider as our primary objective. That said, we have, although it's not reflected in this mid-year report because it's only recently happened, and we're obviously into the second half of the year, we have just placed £2 million with, I can't remember the counterparty, we have placed £2 million, one on 3 months and one for 6 months in a social bond. It's one of the main high street banks. It may be HSBC, Barclays or Lloyds. Can't remember exactly one. When we bring back the list to the next committee, I'll be able to tell you exactly who it is. But we were able to place it with them because the actual differential between the yield on their standard deposits and their ESG deposit was marginal. It took a really small hit, or haircut as they like to call in financial terms, really small trim in order to be able to place the rates weren't that much lower to go for the ESG. So we were able to justify it on that basis because it wasn't costing us a lot of money, but we're still able to tick those ESG boxes.
Thank you very much.
Councillor Garner.
That sort of raised a question for me, actually. You mentioned, I can't remember exactly the phrase you used, but you have to weigh up against the ethical investment, the return you can get by, well, in plain terms, not being ethical investments. Is that a statutory thing, or is that, I mean, could the council make a decision to say, actually, no, we don't want to do that. We actually want to put our ethics above our make as much as we can?
There's a whole myriad of different legislation that's in place. Some of it is, I can't remember exactly offhand, but I can look into this specific issue and report back to the committee. Some of it's statute stuff that we have to, under statute, follow it. Some of it is statutory guidance, where it says you have to give consideration to X, Y, Z. So it doesn't mean you have to do it, but you have to show you've considered it, rather than just going off rogue and doing something else. As long as I think it's the latter, in which case, as long as we've demonstrated we've considered that, we could potentially do something different. But again, that would be a decision for full council when they approve this treasury management strategy.
Okay, because that might be handy, full sort of analysis of that might be handy for the new council to consider when elected in May.
Yep. Thank you, Councillor.
Any further questions or comments? No? Great. So the recommendation for this report is recommend this report and annexes including each of the key elements listed, which are, I'll read them out, the capital plans, prudential indicators and limits for 2023 to 24 to 2025 26, including the authorised limit prudential indicator, the minimum revenue provision MRP policy, the Treasury Management Strategy for 2023 to 24, 2025 to 26, and the Treasury Indicators, the Investment Strategy for 2023 to 24, contained in the Treasury Management Strategy, including the detailed criteria, the Capital Strategy for 2023 to 24, and the Non-Treasury Investments Report for 2023 to 24. Please can I have a proposer and a seconder? Proposed by Councillor Duckworth, seconded by Councillor Lees. Unless I hear any objection, I will take this as approved. That is approved. That concludes the business for tonight's meeting. I declare this meeting closed at 20:42. Good night.